The morning Ada Rourke stood alone in the middle of Caldera's single dusty street with a Winchester rifle in one hand and a cast iron pot in the other. She had not yet decided which one she would need more, but she suspected, before the week was through, she would need both equally. It was the autumn of 1878, deep in the New Mexico territory, where the land was the color of rust, and the sky was so blue it made a person ache in the chest just to look at it. Caldera was a town of maybe 200 souls, most of them stubborn, most of them tired, and nearly all of them people who had come west looking for something they had not quite found yet. There was a general store run by a man named Elias Crumb, a livery stable, a church with a cracked bell, a saloon called the Dusty Pedal that served whiskey a shade too brown, a small schoolhouse at the edge of town, and a scattering of homes and homesteads fanning out like spokes on a wheel from the town's center. Ada Rourke lived in a two-room house at the northern edge of town with a kitchen garden out back and a root cellar that most people in Caldera had forgotten she possessed. She was 31 years old, with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned at the back of her neck and green eyes that were steady and slow to blink. The kind of eyes that made a person feel like she was measuring them for something, though she would have told you she was only listening. She had come to Caldera 4 years earlier as the wife of Patrick Rourke, a land surveyor from Missouri who had loved her fiercely and died of a fever before their second anniversary, leaving her with $40, a house she had mostly built with her own hands after the original one burned, and a reputation in town as a woman who asked no one for anything and expected the same courtesy in return. She kept chickens. She kept a milk cow named Bessie with a temper that rivaled most men Ada had known. She had a kitchen garden that ran to beans, squash, tomatoes, and herbs, and in the root cellar beneath the back step she stored enough food to last a hard winter if she was careful about it. She had a talent for cooking that bordered on something close to art, though she would have called it nothing more than necessity, and on Sundays she sometimes brought pies to the church potluck that drew a line of people so long it wrapped around the building. She was, in every practical sense, the most self-sufficient person in Caldera. And on the first morning of the siege, that quality was about to become the thing that saved every single life within the town's borders. It began on a Tuesday in early October, the kind of morning that smelled of sage and cold stone, when a man named Doyle Cavett rode into Caldera with 9 armed riders behind him. Cavett was not local. He was a criminal of the wandering sort, the kind that moved from territory to territory just ahead of the law, and he had chosen Caldera because it was small. It was relatively isolated. The nearest marshal's office was 30 miles to the east, and he had heard from a drifter 3 weeks prior that the town's bank had just received a significant payroll deposit meant for a silver mine operation up in the hills. He was right about the deposit. He was wrong about how easy the town would be. Elias Crumb's teenage nephew, a boy named Hector who was 17 and had more nerve than sense, spotted the riders coming and ran to warn the town before Cavett's men had even cleared the ridge. By the time Cavett and his 9 men rode down Caldera's main street, they found themselves facing 14 armed men standing in a line across the road. The banker had already sent the mine's payroll out the back window with his wife, who had ridden with it to the east in a buckboard before the riders had even made the ridge. Cavett was not a man who admitted defeat with grace. He pulled his men to the eastern end of town, set up positions on the high ground around the ridge to the north and the dry creek bed to the south, and declared, through a messenger sent under a white handkerchief, that no one would come in and no one would go out until the town's people decided to hand over the money or everything of value they possessed. He gave them 9 days. After 9 days, he said, he would take matters into his own hands. The 14 armed men who had faced him down were still standing in the street when the messenger rode back out, but now the defiance on their faces was mixed with something colder and quieter, because every one of them had just realized the same thing. They could hold the town. They had the numbers to do it, barely. but you could not eat a rifle. And Caldera's general store, which was also the only real food supply in town for the families that relied on it rather than their own small stores, held maybe 3 days of food for 200 people if they stretched it. It was Ada Rourke who stepped off her porch and walked to the center of the street while the men were still talking and said, clearly and without particular drama, "Come with me." Most of them followed her, though 2 of the older ranchers later admitted they had not quite known why at the time, only that her voice had that quality of a woman who has already thought 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room and is simply waiting for the rest of them to catch up. She took them to her root cellar first. She had smoked pork, cured beans, dried corn, salt, sugar, preserved tomatoes, dried herbs, pickled vegetables, and flour enough for a week, all organized with the kind of precision that suggested she had always expected a day might come when it would be needed. Then she took them to the back of the church, where the congregation kept a modest pantry of donated goods for the poor. Then she walked them through the kitchens of every family willing to open their doors, and she made a list in careful pencil on a sheet of paper, noting everything that could be rationed, everything that could be stretched, everything that a good cook could make feed twice as many people as you might think. By nightfall of the first day, Ada had organized Caldera's food supply into a communal kitchen run out of the church hall, had divided the cooking and rationing duties among 9 women who had volunteered to help, and had established a meal schedule that would, if they were careful and willing, feed the whole town for 9 days. The men held the perimeter. Ada held everything else. She woke before dawn every morning of the siege. While the town slept as much as fear would allow, she was at the fire, starting the first pot of the day. Bean soup stretched with wild herbs that she sent the older children to gather from the edges of town where it was still safe. Cornbread made thinner than usual but baked with enough skill that nobody really complained. A pot of stew that she somehow managed to make different every day despite working from roughly the same base ingredients, because Ada Rourke understood that people could endure almost anything if they felt, even briefly, that someone was taking care of them. A meal that surprised them, that had warmth and flavor and some small gesture of dignity, that was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. On the second day, she negotiated with a rancher named Prout whose small homestead sat on the interior edge of the town's perimeter, convincing him to give up his second pig to the communal pot in exchange for a promise she made in front of witnesses that she would help him rebuild his fence in the spring. Prout, who was a practical man and liked pork less than he liked his fence, agreed. On the third day, one of the town's older residents, a German-born woman named Hilda Bauer who had been in Caldera since before there were enough buildings to call it a town, brought Ada 2 large jars of rye flour she had been hoarding since spring, and Ada made a dark bread with it that came out dense and slightly sour and wonderful, and old Hilda sat at the kitchen table and wept in the satisfied way of someone who has just seen something valued not wasted. On the fourth day, Cavett's men shot out the church's cracked bell, perhaps to remind the town they were still there, and Ada walked out of the kitchen with flour on her apron and watched the pieces of the bell land in the dust, and then went back inside and said to the women in the kitchen, "They missed the stovepipe, which is what would have actually hurt us." On the fifth day, 2 of the children discovered a cache of wild onions growing in a shady corner of the schoolyard, and Ada made an onion gravy that the schoolteacher, a younger woman named Pearl Hess, said was the finest thing she had ever put in her mouth in her life, which was saying something because Pearl Hess had grown up in St. Louis. On the 6th day, a man named Ford, one of the 14 riflemen, was grazed along the upper arm by a shot from Cavett's position when he moved too far into the open. It was not serious, but it frightened the town, and that evening Ada sat with Ford at the kitchen table while she cleaned and wrapped his wound, and she talked to him very steadily about ordinary things, about the onion gravy, and whether onions were more vegetable or more herb, which was a question she had genuinely been considering. And Ford, who was 52 years old and had been in 2 wars, later told anyone who would listen that her voice had been more calming than any medicine he had taken in his life. On the seventh day, the flour ran low enough that Ada had to cut the bread ration by half, and she stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the remaining supplies with the kind of expression that never quite became despair because she would not allow it, but which was very close to the edge of something difficult. Pearl Hesse, who had become her closest companion through the long days of the siege, stood beside her and said, "What do we do?" Ada looked at the beans and the remaining salt pork and the dried corn and the jars of preserved tomatoes, and she said, after a long moment, "We make puzzle. I learned it from a woman down near Sakaro. The hominy makes it filling, and the corn stretches further than bread does." She said it with such quiet certainty that Pearl nodded and began pulling out the pots before Ada had even finished the sentence. On the 8th day, Cavett sent another message under a white handkerchief. The message said that the town had 1 day left and that he would be coming in at sunrise on the 10th day to take what was owed him. The 14 riflemen read the message in the street. Ada was told about it over dinner, and she received the news with the same steady face she had worn every day of the past 8, and then she served the puzzle, which was extraordinary, and she sat with the children at the far end of the long table and helped a small boy named Tobias, who was 6 and had not slept well in 3 days, eat his dinner, and she told him a story about a coyote and a river that she made up as she went along. On the 9th day, the town of Caldera was still standing, and every single one of its 200 residents was still alive and still fed. The food had run nearly to the bottom. Ada had used everything she had, everything the church had, and had stretched it all with the kind of skill that belonged to someone who understood hunger not as an abstraction, but as a real and personal enemy. She had kept the siege at bay in the way that is never written about in the newspapers or recorded in official dispatches, the way that is simply done by someone who decided it needed doing and then did it. That night she sat on her porch in the cool October dark and listened to the coyotes somewhere out past the ridge, and she was, for the first time in 8 days, very tired. Not the good tired of a day's honest labor, but the deeper, hollower kind that comes when you have held something together through sheer force of will, and the will has finally asked to rest. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the stars and thought about Patrick, as she sometimes did when the world was quiet, and she thought about the way things end and the way they begin again, and whether there was any pattern to it that a person could learn to read if they only looked long enough. She did not come to any conclusions. She went to bed. She slept 4 hours. At first light she was back at the fire. Timothy Warren rode into Caldera on the morning of the 10th day from the west, which was not the direction anyone was watching. He came over the low ridge that bordered the town's western edge just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, and the light hit him and his horse at that particular angle that made them look, for a moment, like they had been cut from the same piece of amber. A tall man on a long-legged roan mare, wearing a coat the color of weathered saddle leather, his hat brim low against the rising sun. He had ridden through the night from a place called Agua Negra, 40 miles west, where he had heard from a trader passing through that there was trouble in Caldera, that a crew of armed men had sealed it off, and that the town needed help. Timothy Warren was 34 years old and had been riding in the service of the federal marshal's office out of Santa Fe for the past 6 years, though he held the appointment loosely, the way a man holds something he values precisely, because it never became routine. He had been born in Virginia, had come west at 20 after the war, had tried cattle, tried mining, tried 3 different towns, and none of them had taken hold in the way that a place needs to in order to feel like home. He was a careful man, not cautious exactly, but careful the way a craftsman is careful, with attention and intention, because sloppiness in his line of work had consequences that were difficult to undo. He was broad through the shoulders and had a quality of stillness about him, even when he was moving, that suggested he was always thinking about the thing past the immediate thing, always looking at the second problem while the first one was still happening. He came in from the west because the western approach was the blind side of Cavett's position, something he had noted when he had scouted the ridge from a distance just after midnight. He had spent the hours before dawn counting men, estimating positions, gauging where the gaps were, and then he had rested for 2 hours against his horse's warm flank in the cold dark and waited for enough light to move. He came down the western slope without announcing himself, tied his horse at the back of the livery stable, and walked through the sleeping town toward the church, which was where the light was coming from at this hour, and where, judging by the smell of wood smoke and something deeply good, food was being made. He stopped in the doorway of the church hall. Ada Rourke was standing at the stove with her back to him. Her hair was pinned, but several pieces of it had come loose and hung along her neck. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows. She was stirring a pot with the kind of focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this for a long time without rest, and the kitchen behind her told a story he could read clearly: the nearly empty sacks, the careful organization of the last remaining stores, the evidence of 9 days of sustaining an entire town with next to nothing. He stood there for a moment before he said anything, because the scene arrested him in a way he had not expected. Then he said quietly, so as not to startle her, "Morning." She turned. She had a ladle in her hand, and she held it the way someone holds something when they are not sure yet whether it is a tool or a weapon. But her face settled quickly when she saw him, because she had the quality of a person who assesses things fast and accurately. And what she saw was a man with a badge on the inside of his coat that she could just see through the open front of it, with steady eyes and a face that had spent a lot of time in the weather, and no particular threat in his posture. "Morning," she said. "You Ada Rourke?" he asked. "I am." "I heard about the siege," he said. "I'm Timothy Warren. I ride with the marshal's office out of Santa Fe. I've got 6 more men coming up the eastern road from Rosario. They should be here within the hour." She looked at him for a moment. "6 men," she said. "That's right. Cavett has 10. "I know," he said. "You counted them. Last night from the ridge," he said. "The eastern road is the way they'll run when we move. It's also the way I want them to run, because there's nothing east of here but flat ground for 40 miles and nowhere to hide." She considered this. Then she nodded once and turned back to the stove. "Sit down if you want," she said. "There's coffee." He sat at the long table and she poured coffee from the pot that sat on the back of the stove, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and said, "How long have you been at this?" 9 days, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at the kitchen around him again, the empty sacks, the organized remains, the evidence of 9 days of this. He said slowly, "You fed the whole town for 9 days. There are 200 people in this town," she said, "and they were afraid." "People are better able to be afraid if they are not also hungry." He looked at her. The morning light through the church's narrow window was just reaching the stove, and it caught the copper in her hair and the line of her jaw, and he thought, with the particular clarity of a man who is not often caught off guard, that he had ridden into a great many troubled towns in his life, and he had never seen anything quite like what was standing at this stove. He did not say that. He drank the coffee. It was the best coffee he had tasted in 3 weeks, which was something, because 3 weeks on the trail had made him miss good coffee in the physical way you miss something with your whole body. "This is excellent coffee," he said. She glanced at him over her shoulder with an expression that suggested she found him slightly amusing. "Thank you. How did you manage it? The coffee, I mean, after 9 days." "I was rationing it very carefully," she said. "This is the last pot. I was saving it for when something ended in one direction or another." He understood what she meant. He set the cup down and said, "I'll ride out to meet my men when they come over the ridge. We'll push from 2 sides and drive Cavett's crew east. It should be quick and the town should come through it without much damage." "Should be," she said. "Yes," he said. "Most things are should-be situations." "I know that," she said. "I have been living in a should-be situation for 9 days." He looked at her. She was still stirring the pot, and there was a finality in her movements now, the knowledge that this was the last of what she had managed, and that it had been enough, just enough, and that she had done it through nothing but discipline and intelligence and the refusal to stop. He felt something shift in him, not dramatically, not with the kind of sudden intensity that would have embarrassed him, but quietly and with the solidity of something true. "What are you making?" he asked. "Oatmeal," she said. "The last of it. I am making it with the dried apples from the last jar and a scraping of brown sugar, and I intend it to taste like something that took effort, because the people in this town have taken effort and they deserve to taste that in what they eat." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are a remarkable person, Ada Rourke." She turned to look at him fully then with those slow, measuring green eyes, and she said, "You don't know me, Mr. Warren." "No," he said, "but I know what I'm looking at." She held his gaze for a moment and then turned back to the stove, and the look she wore when she turned away was not quite a smile, but it was something adjacent to one, something private and careful that she had not intended to show. The town began to wake. People filtered into the church hall in twos and threes as they always did at this hour, drawn by warmth and the smell of food and the comfort of other bodies in the same room. They did not know yet that there was a stranger in their midst, or that the 10th day had already begun to shift in tone. They came the way people come to the table during difficult times, with the particular quietness of those who have been together in fear for long enough that the shared fear has become its own kind of language. Timothy greeted each person who came in with a nod and introduced himself simply as a federal man who had come to help. And the word moved quickly enough that, within 20 minutes, the 14 riflemen were gathered in the church hall with their hats in their hands, listening to him lay out the plan with the same economy of words he had used with Ada. Ada served the oatmeal. She moved around the long table with the pot and a ladle, and she put a portion in front of every person, child and adult alike. And when she came to Timothy, who was still talking to the men at the head of the table, she set a bowl in front of him without interrupting, and he paused in his explanation, looked at the bowl, and then looked up at her with an expression that was briefly unguarded and then composed itself again. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said, and moved on. He watched her for just a moment longer, then was entirely neutral. Then he turned back to the men. The plan worked, as plans made by careful men with sufficient knowledge tend to do, though not without the friction that all real plans encounter when they meet the actual world. Timothy's 6 men arrived as the town was finishing breakfast, coming over the eastern ridge in the early morning light and spreading out exactly as Timothy had instructed them to. Timothy and 2 of Caldera's riflemen took the north approach. The remaining 12 riflemen held the center. Cavett and his men, faced suddenly with opposition on 2 sides and the flat eastern ground as their only viable escape, made the decision that men in their position generally make when the alternative is a pitched fight against unknown odds in a town that has clearly decided to defend itself. They ran, not without firing. There were shots exchanged at the edges of town, enough to crack the morning air and send the children and women in the church flat to the floor, and Ada crouched over the youngest children with her body and listened to the shots and counted them with a part of her mind that had apparently been doing this for 9 days and was well practiced at it. But the shots were the shots of retreat, not assault, and within 20 minutes of the first crack of a rifle, Cavett's men were thundering down the eastern road in a cloud of dust, and Timothy's men were riding after them, keeping them moving, not closing to fight but pushing them far enough that coming back would be a decision requiring more organization and nerve than Cavett was likely to muster in the foreseeable future. The town of Caldera came out into its own street in the morning light and stood in silence for a moment, and then someone, it might have been Elias Crumb's nephew Hector, let out a sound that was half laugh and half something else, something that had been under pressure for 9 days and needed to go somewhere. And then everyone was making that sound at once, and it traveled through the crowd and up into the blue New Mexico sky. Ada Rourke stood on the steps of the church hall with her hands folded in front of her and watched her town celebrate in the street. Pearl Hesse came and stood beside her and put her arm around Ada's waist and Ada leaned her head briefly against Pearl's shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. Timothy came back into town an hour later. He rode down the main street at a walk, his coat dusty and his hat still low, and he swung down from the roan mare in front of the livery, and handed the reins to the stable hand, and walked toward the church hall because it was the only place he had really spent any time in this town, and it was, he found, the place he wanted to go. Ada was washing the pots. He stopped in the doorway again as he had that morning, and she was at the basin with her sleeves rolled up and her hair slightly more defeated than it had been at first light, and the kitchen behind her was clean and orderly in the way of a field that has been fully harvested, everything done, nothing wasted. "It's over," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard the quiet." He came in and sat at the table again, and she poured him water because the coffee was gone, and he drank it and said, "The whole thing took maybe 40 minutes from when we moved." 9 days and 40 minutes, she said. "The 9 days was your part," he said. She sat down across from him at the table. It was the first time she had sat at that table in 9 days that was not in service of something else, not to plan or organize or consult, and the sensation of sitting down with nothing immediately required of her was so unfamiliar that she felt it physically, a kind of unwinding that ran from her shoulders down through her hands. "What happens now for you?" she asked. "Do you need to ride after them?" "My men will take it from here," he said. "They'll follow Cavett far enough east to be certain he's not regrouping, then they'll loop back to Rosario and write up the incident for the marshal's record." "And you?" He looked at her. "I'm not sure yet," he said. She met his eyes, and there was a beat of silence between them that was not awkward but was full of something, the way a room is full before a fire is lit, the potential of warmth before the warmth itself. "You look like you haven't slept in several days," he said. "I haven't really," she said. "And you look like you have fed an entire town on will and ingenuity and whatever happened to be in that root cellar." "That's exactly what I've done," she said. "How long have you been here?" "In Caldera." 4 years, she said. "I came with my husband, Patrick. He died 2 years in." "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it simply, without the particular awkwardness that some men use when they do not know how to hold someone else's grief, which she had noticed over the years was actually quite rare. "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man, and I was glad to have known him." "Did you stay here because it was your home by then, or because going back felt like retreating?" She looked at him with something that was close to surprise. "Both," she said. "And because there was nowhere particular to go back to. Patrick was my home in the sense that it was home when he was alive, and when he was gone I had to find another way to mean it." "Did you," he asked, "find another way?" "I'm here, aren't I?" she said. He smiled then. It was not a large smile, but it changed his face considerably, made it warmer and less weathered-looking, and Ada noted it with the part of her that noted things and tucked them away for later examination. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Virginia born, then everywhere more or less. I came west after the war and never found a reason to stop moving until I took the marshal's appointment, and even then I was always riding." "Do you like it, the riding?" "I like solving things," he said. "I like arriving somewhere where something's wrong and leaving it less wrong. Whether I like the riding itself is a separate question. There are mornings it's very beautiful and mornings it's just cold and long." She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, short and warm, and it crossed her face and was gone quickly, the laugh of someone who does not perform amusement but experiences it directly. He looked at her when she laughed with an attention that he was aware of and could not entirely correct for. The rest of the day moved around them. The town of Caldera celebrated as small towns do, not extravagantly, but with the concentrated joy of people who have come through something together and find themselves on the other side of it. Someone rolled a barrel of something out of the dusty pedal, which Ada regarded with mild disapproval, and someone else found a fiddle, and there was music in the street in the afternoon, and children ran through it all with the particular energy of children who have been told to stay indoors for 9 days and have a great deal to reclaim. Ada remained at the church for a while. helping to distribute the small stores of food that remained and watching the kitchen return to its ordinary purposes. Pearl Hesse hugged her twice. Old Hilda Bauer shook her hand with both of hers and said something in German that Ada did not speak, but understood perfectly from the expression that accompanied it. Timothy spent the day in Caldera for reasons he would have told you were practical. His horse needed rest. His report needed to be gathered. There were accounts to take from the riflemen about Cavett's behavior during the siege. But which were, if he was being honest with himself in the way that he generally tried to be, at least partially about not being in a hurry to leave a town where a woman named Ada Rourke was washing pots. In the late afternoon, he found himself outside her house on the northern edge of town. He had not intended to go there. He had been walking and thinking, and the walk had arrived him here, which he recognized as a thing that happens when you stop pretending you don't know where you want to be. She was in the kitchen garden, checking the last of the late squash, crouching beside a fat yellow gourd and pressing the skin with her thumb. She heard him coming and looked up without alarm, which suggested she had heard his footsteps earlier and had already assessed them. "The squash survived the siege," he said. "The squash survived admirably," she said. "I was more worried about the beans, but they seem to be all right." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. "Did you need something?" "I don't know," he said honestly. She looked at him with the measuring expression he had come to recognize in the 12 hours he had known her. "That is an unusual answer for a man in your profession." "I'm not usually uncertain about things," he admitted. "I find I am today." She said nothing to that, but she did not look away either, and after a moment she said, "Come in if you want. I was going to make supper. There's not much, but there's enough." "You've been feeding people for 9 days," he said. "You should let someone else cook. Who is going to cook better than me?" she asked, with such calm self-assessment that it was not arrogance but simply accuracy, and he laughed, which surprised him. He helped her in the kitchen, or tried to, which mostly meant staying out of her way while she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who has cooked in a small space for long enough that every motion is purposeful and nothing is wasted. He peeled potatoes because she handed them to him, and that seemed to be what was needed, and he sat at her kitchen table and peeled potatoes, and they talked. They talked easily. That was the thing he kept returning to in his mind later. How easy it was. The way conversation with her did not require the usual effort of social performance, but was instead just two people thinking out loud in the same room. She asked him about the marshal's work, not with the anxious fascination that some people brought to questions about gunfighters and outlaws, but with genuine curiosity about the practical and the procedural, about what it actually looked like to bring order to places that did not have enough of it. He asked her about the 9 days, and she told him, not with any particular drama but with the detail and honesty of someone recounting a thing they want remembered accurately. He told her about Virginia, about the rolling green of it and how it had felt, after the war, like a country that was beautiful in a way he could no longer trust. She told him about Missouri, where she had grown up on a farm with 4 brothers, and about how the farm had prepared her for the West in every way that mattered, which was that it had taught her what you can do with limited resources if you refuse to consider them limiting. They ate supper at her small table as the sun went down outside the kitchen window, and the meal was simple potato soup with dried herbs and a small piece of the salt pork. She had held back from the communal store and biscuits that were light and crusty in the way of biscuits that are made by someone who has made them so many times the ratio lives in their hands rather than their head. And he ate 3 biscuits and was quiet about it, but she noticed, because she noticed things. "You are welcome to stay in town tonight," she said when the meal was done. "The hotel, such as it is, has a room, Mr. Crumb's general store, or what used to be a hotel. The roof only leaks in one corner." "I appreciate it," he said. "Your horse needs the rest," she said, which was a practical reason she offered him and which both of them understood was also something more than that. He stayed. He stayed that night and the following morning. which was officially because he needed to complete his account of the incident and see to the formal documentation of Cavitt's identification and movements, which was true, and unofficially because each conversation he had with Ada Rourke made him feel that the previous one had not been quite finished, that there was more he wanted to know, and more he suspected she would say if he kept listening. On the second morning, she made breakfast for the two of them and Pearl Hess, who arrived at Ada's door at 7:30 the way she apparently often did, with a jar of honey she had gotten from a rancher's wife in trade, and the look of someone who had heard things through the very efficient gossip network of a small town and was here to assess them directly. Pearl Hess was 26, bright, curious, and constitutionally unable to be indirect about anything, which Ada appeared to find both amusing and slightly exhausting, which Timothy could understand after approximately 4 minutes of Pearl's company. Pearl looked at Timothy with the frank assessment of a schoolteacher who spends most of her professional life evaluating whether she is being told the truth and said, "Are you staying then?" Timothy, who was in the middle of drinking coffee, said, "For a day or so." Pearl looked at Ada. Ada looked at her biscuit. Pearl looked back at Timothy with a slightly wider smile and said, "Good," in the tone of someone who considers the matter settled. After breakfast, Timothy walked with Ada to the general store, which Elia's Crumb had already reopened, and was restocking as quickly as the supply wagon from Rosario, which had been held up by Cavitt's siege, and was now on its way, would allow. The town had the particular quality of the morning after difficulty, everyone moving a little more freely, a little more loudly, with the conscious pleasure of ordinary things. The blacksmith was at his fire, and the sound of the hammer was not alarming. The children were at the schoolhouse, and through the window you could hear Pearl Hess's voice, already teaching, steady and clear. Ada spoke to Elia's Crumb about restocking the communal stores she had depleted from the church pantry, making notes in the same careful pencil on the same kind of paper she had used to inventory the food at the beginning of the siege. And Timothy stood nearby and observed the way the town related to her, the way people looked at her as they passed, the particular quality of respect that is not about authority but about something more durable. The trust that comes from having been kept alive by someone's competence and care. An old man stopped her on the street to tell her that the puzzle on the 7th day had been something he thought about before sleeping, and that it had comforted him. A woman with 2 small children held Ada's hands for a moment, and did not say anything, but looked at her with the full weight of what she meant. Hector, who had started the whole 9-day clock ticking with his warning run, took off his hat to Ada when she passed him, with the earnest formality of a 17-year-old who is in the middle of learning what it means to respect someone. Timothy watched all of this and felt the shift in himself settle and deepen, the way something settles when it finds the place it belongs. He found her alone by the post office in the afternoon, a small low building at the south end of the main street, where she had gone to see if any mail had been held during the siege. She was standing with an envelope in her hand that she had just opened, reading the letter inside with a stillness that suggested the letter was not particularly good news. He came to stand nearby and said, "Everything all right?" She folded the letter with the careful motions of someone composing themselves. "It's from my brother," she said. "Emmett, he's in Kansas. He wants me to come back east or eastish. He says it's not safe here." "He's not wrong that it was not safe this week," Timothy said carefully. "He has been not wrong about that at various points for the past 4 years," she said. "Every time there's trouble he writes to say it's not safe and I should come to Kansas." She looked down at the folded letter. "Emmett is a good man, he worries." "Do you want to go to Kansas?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said finally. "Caldera is my home. I built it to be my home. The people here know me and I know them, and I have something here. What would I have in Kansas?" "Emmett's hospitality, and the constant implication that I could not manage on my own." "For what it's worth," Timothy said, "having seen what you managed this week, I don't think anyone watching closely would make that implication." She looked at him with the expression she wore when something surprised her, not dramatically, just a small opening of the careful face, a brief visibility of the interior. "No," she said. "You wouldn't, but you are not my brother." "No," he agreed. "I'm not." The afternoon was long and golden, the way October afternoons in New Mexico are when the world slows down and the light takes its time. And they walked back toward her house, because the day had angled in that direction without either of them particularly planning it. And they sat on her porch in the fading warmth, and she mended a tear in a shirt that had nothing to do with the siege, but was simply a shirt that needed mending. And he read a week-old newspaper that Elias Crumb had pressed on him, with the enthusiasm of a man who had been unable to share his newspaper with anyone for 9 days. And the silence between them was the kind of silence that is not absence but presence. "You're leaving tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. He lowered the newspaper. "I should," he said. "There's a report due in Santa Fe and the marshal will have questions." "Of course," she said. He watched her mend for a moment. Her hands were steady and deft, the needle moving with the same economy of motion she brought to everything, and the shirt was going to be perfectly repaired. He could see that already. "I'll come back," he said, "if that's something you'd want." She looked up from the mending, and her eyes were very level and very green in the late afternoon light, and she said, "Is that something you'd want?" "Yes," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she said, "All right, then." And she went back to the mending, but the corner of her mouth had the same thing it had had that first morning, the not-quite smile that was more honest than a smile would have been. And he looked at it and felt something in his chest that was warm and certain, and did not feel like anything that was going to go away. He left the following morning, early, in the cool gray before the sun was up, because he had learned that leaving things at dawn was better than leaving them at noon, when the day was fully bright, and the leaving had more room to feel like what it was. Ada came to the livery because she had heard him up and had made coffee and brought it out in a tin cup that she did not expect to see again, and did not appear troubled by that. He drank the coffee in the doorway of the livery with the roan mare saddled behind him, and Ada standing with her arms folded against the morning chill in a heavy wool shawl, and he said, 6 weeks, maybe 8. I'll be back before the deep cold comes." "The deep cold comes in December here," she said. "Sometimes late November." "Then I'll be back before November ends," he said. She nodded. "Safe riding," she said. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. He paused for a moment with the empty cup in his hand and then said, "Ada." Just her name, the way a person says a name when they want to make sure it is real, when they want to put a sound to the thing they are carrying with them. She looked at him. "I meant what I said," he said, "about what I said on the porch." "I know you did," she said. "I believe what people say when they say it simply. You said it simply." He rode out. She stood in the livery door and watched him go until he was over the western ridge. And then she walked back to her house in the early morning quiet and started a fire in the stove and made a proper breakfast for herself, the first one in 10 days that was just for her. And she ate it at her own table and thought about a tall man on a roan mare and the way he had said her name. For weeks later, she got a letter. It was not a long letter, because Timothy Warren was not a man who used more words than a thing required, but it was a careful letter, the kind that is clearly written with attention to what the receiver will understand. He wrote that the marshal's report was complete, and that Cavett had been identified as wanted in 3 territories, and that there were people assigned to his pursuit. He wrote that Santa Fe was cold already, and that he had been given another assignment east of Albuquerque, but that it was the kind of thing that would be done in 2 weeks. He wrote at the end, in the same plain tone as everything else, that he thought about the porch and the newspaper and the coffee at dawn, and that he was looking forward to coming back to Caldera in a way that made the territory between here and there feel shorter than it was. Ada read the letter twice. Then she wrote back, and her letter was longer than his, because she had more to say and was less suspicious of words than he was. She told him the supply wagon had arrived and the general store was fully stocked. She told him the church had taken up a collection to get a new bell, and that the old one had landed in 3 pieces in the street, and one of the pieces had been shaped so perfectly like a crescent that Tobias, the 6-year-old who liked her coyote stories, had claimed it for himself and carried it around in his coat pocket. She told him that Pearl Hess had begun courting a young man who had come to Caldera with the supply wagon and decided to stay, a carpenter named Ames who had a good face and the sense to appreciate Pearl's directness rather than be flattened by it. She wrote at the end that she was glad he was coming back and that she had not given the tin coffee cup away yet, on the working assumption that it would be returned. He was back in Caldera before the end of November, as he had said. He rode in on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not a day of any significance except that Caldera looked beautiful that day, cold and quiet under a white-blue sky, with the last of the cottonwood leaves gold against it. And Ada was in the kitchen garden covering the last of the root vegetables with straw for the winter, and she heard the hoofbeats and looked up and saw him coming over the western ridge in the amber afternoon light. And she straightened up slowly and pressed the dirt from her hands against her apron. He came down the main street at the same easy walk as before and swung down in front of the livery and said something to the stable hand and then walked toward her house, and she was standing at the garden gate when he came up the path, and they looked at each other the way people look at each other when they have spent 6 weeks thinking about a moment and are now in it, and it is better than the thinking of it. "You came back," she said. "I said I would," he said. "Men say many things," she said. "That's true," he said. "But I meant it." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold air moved her hair. The last cottonwood leaves fell slowly in the yard behind him. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." He stayed 3 weeks that time. He stayed in the hotel room with the leaking corner, which he managed by moving the narrow bed, and during the days he helped where he could with Elia's crumb supply inventory, with a fence repair at the church, with the kind of small necessary work that a town always has in abundance, and that a pair of capable hands can always find. He ate supper at Ada's table every evening. They talked for hours, sometimes at the table and sometimes on the porch wrapped in blankets against the November cold, and the talking deepened, the way conversation deepens when 2 people stop presenting themselves and start simply being themselves. He told her about a brother he had lost in the war, the younger one, the one who had followed Timothy into the army at 16 because Timothy was going and he could not imagine not going where Timothy went. He told it plainly and without performance, but she could hear in the plain telling how long that weight had lived in him, and she did not try to lift it or minimize it, only sat with him in it the way a person sits with someone in a room that is too cold, close enough that the warmth is shared. She told him about the early years of her marriage, when she and Patrick had still been figuring out what kind of people they were together, the particular comedy of 2 strong-willed people in a small house learning when to give ground and finding, eventually, that giving ground to someone you loved was not defeat but a kind of gift. She said she had loved Patrick and that she had grieved him honestly and completely, and that she had come out the other side of the grief not unchanged but whole, and she thought that was the most she could ask of herself. He listened. He listened the way he did everything, with attention and without interruption, turning what she said over carefully before he responded. One night in the 3rd week, he was helping her carry wood to the porch from the stack at the side of the house, and when they set the last armload down and straightened up, they were close together in the cold dark, their breath visible, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and the moment had the quality of something that has been building for long enough that, when it arrives, it is not a surprise but a recognition. He said, "Ada." She said, "Yes." And then she reached up and put her hand against the side of his jaw, the way you touch something you are deciding about, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood like that in the cold for a moment that stretched out and held them both. He kissed her gently with the care that careful men bring to everything that matters, and she kissed him back with the directness that was her nature, and it was quiet and warm and sure, and when they stepped back the night air was very cold and very clear and the stars were extraordinary. "All right," she said, which was what she said when something was settled. "All right," he agreed. He went to Santa Fe in December because he had obligations he had made before Caldera, reports and testimony, and the administrative machinery of the federal marshal's work that did not stop, because he had somewhere he preferred to be. He went and he came back, and then he went again, and each time he came back something in him that had always been oriented toward the next road began, very gradually, to reorient toward a particular house at the northern edge of a particular town. In March of 1879, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen, which was where everything important in their relationship had happened, where they had first spoken and first sat down together and first been honest with each other. And he asked her without ceremony, but with the full weight of what he meant behind it, leaning against the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and saying, "I want to stay, Ada. I want Caldera to be where I am, and I want that because of you, and I am asking you to let me." She was at the stove, as she so often was. She turned around slowly, with the composed face she wore when she was feeling something that she was not yet ready to name aloud, and she looked at him for a long time, and he stood there and let her look. "The marshal's work," she said. "What does that mean for staying?" "It means I may need to ride out sometimes," he said. "I would not pretend otherwise, but there are men who hold deputy appointments while being rooted somewhere, and I think the marshal would agree to it. I have given 6 years of traveling. I would like to give the next portion of them to a place." "To a place," she repeated. "To you," he corrected. "The place matters because you are in it." She turned fully to face him. There were tears in her eyes, which was the first time he had seen anything of the kind, and she did not appear to be troubled by them, only honest. "I loved Patrick with my whole heart," she said, "and I know you know that, and I need you to know I am not giving you something lesser because of it." "I know that," he said. "What I have for you is different because you are different," she said. "It's mine and it's whole and it's real." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him for one more moment and then she said, "Yes, Timothy, I'll marry you." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and when he put his arms around her, she pressed her face against his shoulder and he held her. And the kitchen was warm and the light was the early spring gray, and outside the garden was beginning to wake up again, the beans beginning to push up through the soil she had prepared the week before. They were married in Caldera's church in late April of 1879, on a warm day with a blue sky and new spring growth on every hillside, in a ceremony conducted by the minister who had been the first person to eat Ada's bean soup on the first night of the siege, and had never forgotten it. Pearl Hess stood up with Ada, wearing a dress the color of sage and crying with the frank openness she brought to everything. Pearl's carpenter, the young man named Ames, sat in the front pew and looked at Pearl in the way that suggested his own proposal was not far off. The whole town came. Tobias wore the crescent piece of the old church bell pinned to his coat like a medal. There was a proper celebration after, which Ada organized because she could not stop herself from organizing things that needed feeding, and which was magnificent in the way of Caldera celebrations, unpretentious and joyful and full of the kind of food that made people feel genuinely cared for. Old Hilda Bauer made her dark rye bread, which she only made for occasions she felt deserved it. The fiddle player from the 10th day celebration was there again, and had apparently found 2 friends who also played, and the music was lively enough that even Elias Crumb, who was not by nature a dancing man, made 2 turns around the floor with his wife, and looked surprised to find himself enjoying it. Timothy danced with Ada under the open sky, in the same street where she had stood with a rifle and a cast-iron pot on the first morning of the siege, and she put her head briefly on his shoulder and felt the steady warmth of him and the particular piece of something built correctly. He stayed. He took the deputy appointment the marshal agreed to without much argument, because the marshal was a practical man who understood that a good man settled somewhere was more useful to the territory than a good man constantly traveling through it. Timothy rode out on assignments when he was needed, which was not as often as it had been, and he came back each time to the house at the northern edge of Caldera, where the root cellar was full, and the kitchen garden grew, and the smell of something good on the stove reached him before he even had the mare unsaddled. The summer of 1879 was warm and productive. Ada's garden ran to abundance, and she put up more preserved tomatoes than she had ever managed before, and she taught Pearl Hess, who had indeed become Pearl Ames by July, in a ceremony nearly as well attended as Ada and Timothy's, how to make the puzzle, because she believed that knowledge was worth nothing if it was not given away. In the autumn of 1879, Ada told Timothy she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, which was where she told him most things, and his face moved through a sequence of expressions that she watched with the attentive warmth of someone who loves the face they are watching. Surprise, calculation as he did some private arithmetic about the timing and the responsibility, and then something that simply flooded and was unmistakable, and he came to her and held her face in both his large hands and said, "Ada." "Yes," she said, which was what she said when something was settled. Their son was born in June of 1880. They named him James Patrick Warren, the middle name for her first husband, because she felt that love, honestly given, does not diminish by being shared across time, and Timothy understood this and agreed to it without reservation, which was one of the things she knew. In that moment, she had chosen correctly. James Patrick was a loud, opinionated, very hungry infant who announced his preferences about everything from the first week of his life, which Ada took as a sign of good character and Timothy took as a sign of his mother's influence, which was the same thing. The town of Caldera, which had watched these two people come together with the deep investment of a small community in its own story, took considerable pleasure in the baby James. Tobias, now 7, declared himself James's personal guardian with the solemn authority of a child who has been carrying a piece of a bell around in his pocket for 2 years and is accustomed to ceremonial weight. Old Hilda Bower made a cradle blanket out of the same heavy wool she used for her winter shawls, constructed with the solidity of someone who expects their work to last longer than they do, and it was warm enough that James slept in it through his first winter without complaint, which, given the vigor of his complaints about everything else, suggested that Hilda Bower's blanket was genuinely exceptional. Timothy rode out twice in the second half of 1880, once for a week in August and once for 10 days in October, and both times he came back to find the house well managed and James thriving and Ada exactly, as she was competent and self-possessed and warm in the particular way that is not performance but nature. And both times he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before she knew he was there, the way he had stood in the church hall doorway on the morning of the 10th day. And he looked at his life and felt the astonishment of someone who has been given something they did not know they were capable of wanting. In the spring of 1882, they had a daughter. They named her Ruth, for Ada's mother who had died when Ada was 12, a woman Ada described as having the quality of something necessary, which Timothy said was the finest compliment a person could receive. Ruth was quieter than James, which was not saying much, and had her mother's green eyes and her father's quality of stillness, which meant that from approximately 3 months old she appeared to be thinking about the thing past the immediate thing. And Ada said to Timothy one evening that looking at Ruth made her feel observed and assessed in a way she was accustomed to feeling from mirrors and not from infants. By 1883, Timothy had formally resigned the traveling portions of his marshal's appointment and had taken on the role of Caldera's primary law officer, a position the town had been without long enough that his assumption of it was received with the enthusiasm of a place that has been managing without something it needed. He was, as it turned out, very good at the work in the contained and rooted sense, solving disputes before they became violence, building the kind of steady predictability of justice that a town needs in order to feel safe, being a man people could find and trust and come to. Ada had expanded the kitchen garden and taken on a small enterprise of selling preserved goods and baked items to the general store, which Elia's Crumbs stocked and sold at a margin they had negotiated in her favor, because she had driven a harder bargain than he expected, and he respected it. The kitchen of the house at the northern edge of town smelled perpetually of something in progress, herbs hanging to dry, bread cooling on the board, the deep warm smell of stock on the stove. And it was the kind of kitchen that people found themselves drawn to on the pretext of some errand or other, because the real draw was that it felt like the center of something, like warmth made architectural. Pearl Ames had 2 children by 1883, a boy and a girl, and she and Ada had the close and particular friendship of 2 women who had been in the same trench together and come out the other side, which in their case was the siege, literal and actual, and which had the quality of a bond that does not require maintenance, because it was formed under conditions that burned away everything inessential. On an October evening in 1883, 5 years, almost to the day, from the morning Timothy had ridden into Caldera and found Ada at the stove. They sat on the porch as the stars came up over the New Mexico hills, Ada with a cup of tea and Timothy with coffee, and James, who was 3, was asleep inside under Hilda Bower's blanket, and Ruth, who was 1.5 and had very decided opinions about her sleeping schedule, had been persuaded into bed with the help of a coyote story that Ada had told her, with the patient repetition of a woman who had first told that story to a frightened 6-year-old during a siege, and had been telling versions of it ever since. The night air was cool and sage-scented and very clear, the way October nights in that country are, and the stars were the same extraordinary density of stars that Ada had looked at on the 9th night of the siege, sitting alone on this same porch with her hands in her lap. Timothy said, "Do you remember what the town looked like when I rode in?" "I was inside making oatmeal," she said. "I didn't see you ride in." "I stood in the doorway for a minute before I said anything," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard you," he looked at her. "You heard me. You have a distinctive way of standing still," she said. "You make a different quality of silence than most people." He was quiet for a moment, which she supposed was exactly her point, and then he said, "What I thought standing there was that I had never seen anything quite like it, like what you had done." "You said something like that," she said, "early on." "I meant it then, and I mean it more now," he said, "because I know now what it cost and what it took and what you are, and I cannot account for how lucky I am to have ridden in on the 10th day and not some other day." She looked at the stars. Then she turned and looked at him, and her face in the starlight had the full and honest openness of someone who has been careful for a long time and has found, finally, the thing they can be careless with, the one person with whom the guard comes down entirely, because it never needed to go up in the first place. "You are not the only lucky one," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat together in the October dark while the coyotes called somewhere past the ridge and the town of Caldera settled into its evening quiet, all 200 and some odd souls of it, fed and safe, and held by the web of small necessities and generosities that make a place a home. In the years that followed, Caldera grew. The silver mine in the hills ran better than anyone had expected for a decade more, and the payroll that Cavett had once tried to steal became the engine of a modest prosperity that added 40 souls to the town's population and a second general store and a doctor's surgery, which Ada had been advocating for since before the siege. The doctor who came was a young woman from the East, a graduate of one of the new women's medical colleges, and Ada took to her immediately with the warmth she extended to anyone who arrived in a new place knowing their worth and asking no permission for it. James grew into a boy of considerable energy and opinion who showed, from approximately age 5, an aptitude for growing things. He spent his after-school hours in the kitchen garden with a focused attention that was entirely his own, nothing that Ada had pushed him toward, and by the time he was 8, He had doubled the squash yield through methods he explained to Ada with the gravity of a professor that made her press her lips together to contain something very warm and fond. He was going to be a farmer or a botanist or something in between, and either was good. Ruth grew into the child Ada had expected from those early assessing eyes, quiet and precise, and with a quality of justice about her that appeared to be entirely innate, the kind of child who mediates disputes between other children not because she is asked to, but because she finds injustice physically uncomfortable and has the vocabulary to say why. She was going to be a lawyer or a judge or simply the most formidable person in whatever room she entered, which seemed likely regardless of profession. In the winter of 1885, Ada discovered she was expecting again. She told Timothy in the kitchen, as she had both times before, and this time he did not go through any sequence of expressions but simply reached for her immediately, and she laughed against his shoulder at the particular directness of his response. Their second son arrived in August of 1885. They named him Emmett, for her brother in Kansas, who had never entirely stopped writing letters suggesting she come back east but had visited Caldera once in 1882 and come away convinced. He wrote to her afterward that she had built something real and that he supposed he had been wrong about the West, or at least about this particular corner of it. Emmett the younger was, from his first days, the happiest member of the household, with a nature that appeared constitutionally inclined toward contentment, and a laugh that arrived early and often and was of the contagious variety. And James, who was 5½ and had been applying considerable thought to the question of a baby brother, decided within 48 hours that this one was acceptable. Old Hilda Bower, who was by then quite elderly, made a second cradle blanket for Emmett, this one in a slightly different pattern, and delivered it to Ada with a pronouncement in German that Pearl Ames, who had been learning the language from Hilda over the past 2 years, because she felt everyone should be learning something, translated as meaning roughly that some things are worth doing twice. In 1886, Caldera finally got a new church bell, funded partly by community collection and partly by a donation from the silver mines operator, who was not a sentimental man but had been in the church on the 7th day of the siege eating Ada's puzzle and had felt, for the first time in a long while, genuinely human. The bell was hung on a bright October day, and the whole town turned out to hear it ring the first time, and the sound of it went out over the hills and the sage flats and the rust-colored land, and came back as an echo just a beat behind, the way sound comes back in that open country, and it was good. Tobias, who was by then 15 and had recently put the crescent piece of the old bell down on a shelf in his room where he could see it, was standing near Ada when the new bell rang. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and they shared the small private acknowledgement of two people who were in the same place 5 years ago when everything that led to this moment began. "Do you remember the puzzle?" he asked. "I remember everything about those days," she said. "It was the best thing I ever ate," he said. "And I was scared the whole time, but not as scared as I would have been if you hadn't been there." She put her hand on his shoulder briefly. "You were brave," she said. "You all were." "You were braver," he said, with the directness of a teenager who has not yet learned to soften accurate assessments. She smiled at him. "I was practical," she said. "Sometimes that's what brave looks like." Timothy was at her other side, and he had heard the exchange. And when Tobias moved off into the crowd, he looked at her with the expression she knew best of all his expressions, the one that was warm and certain, and occasionally still somewhat astonished after 7 years of marriage, because she was still the thing he had stood in a doorway and been arrested by, still the woman he had said he had never seen anything like. And the truth of that had not diminished but deepened with every year they had stood in the same place together. "Practical," he said. "Practical," she agreed. "The most extraordinary practical person I have ever known," he said, which was a long sentence for him, and she appreciated the effort. "You are very good to me, Timothy Warren," she said. I am only accurate," he said. She laughed and took his arm, and they walked together through the celebrating town, through the people who were their people, past the church with its new bell still ringing, past Elia's Crumb's general store where her preserves were stocked on the shelves, past the schoolhouse where Ruth and James had learned their letters from Pearl Ames, and where Emmett would go in a few years with his father's steadiness and his mother's green eyes. Past the northern end of the main street and up the path to the house at the edge of town, where the kitchen garden ran to abundance, and the root cellar was full, and the stove was warm, and the children were somewhere inside being loved by a household that was, in every way that mattered, complete. She stood at the gate of the kitchen garden and looked at it in the October afternoon light, the last of the season's growth cut back and the soil prepared for the cold to come. And she thought of the autumn 5 years before, and the rifle and the cast iron pot and the 9 days and the 10th morning. And she thought of how it is impossible to know, when you are standing in the middle of a hard thing, what it is making you into or where it is carrying you. She only knew that it had carried her here. Timothy came to stand beside her at the gate and looked at the garden with her, and the evening star was just appearing above the western ridge where she had first watched him ride in, and the air smelled of sage and cold stone and the particular sweetness of late harvest, and she leaned against his side and felt his arm come around her, solid and certain as everything he did. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That the beans did well this year," she said. He laughed, which was a sound she loved, low and brief and real, and she said, "That I am glad you rode in on the 10th day." "So am I," he said. "Every day I am glad." The bell rang once more in the distance, its new voice clear and bright over the town, over the hills, over the wide rust-colored land, and they stood together at the garden gate and listened to it carry. And it was good, and it was enough, and it was everything.